Hello and welcome. I'm Kamla.
My guests today are Ken Burns and Raymond Santana. Ken Burns has a new documentary out called The Central Park 5, and here's a quick look at it.
I want us to remember what happened that day and be horrified by ourselves.
The Central Park 5 is a powerful new documentary by filmmaker Ken Burns. The film follows the story of how 5 young New York teenagers were tried as adults and convicted of rape in the famous case of the Central Park jogger. In 1989, a young female jogger's body was discovered in Central Park. She had been raped and was in bad shape when her body was discovered. The teenagers spent between 6 to 13 years in prison before a confession from a serial rapist and DNA evidence proved their innocence.
I'm the one that did this.
The Central Park 5 tells the story of 5 young men and how a miscarriage of justice impacted their lives. Ken Burns and Raymond Santana were in San Francisco to attend the Mill Valley Film Festival, and we caught up with them to talk about the film. The Central Park 5 is your latest film, and this is a documentary on a subject that was high profile, and the then mayor of New York called it the crime of the century. So take us back to that day in New York, in Central Park, which is what the story is all about.
On August 19th, 1989, a woman was found brutally raped in the northern reaches of Central Park, a white woman. Earlier that evening, several black and Hispanic youths had been rounded up after they were caught sort of mischief making and were going to be released for unlawful assembly. It was then decided by the police that maybe that they were responsible for this, and eventually five young African American and Hispanic boys, 14, 15, and 16 years old, were charged with this crime, even though they said they had nothing to do with it. They were able to extract false confessions from them, and they went to jail for upwards of 13 years before the real rapist came forward and admitted his guilt, and his DNA matched. And even though they'd all gotten out of jail, the judge vacated the convictions, and the young men initiated a civil suit against the city of New York, which is a decade long and still pending.
Okay, and so Raymond is one of the young persons.
Yeah.
So describe that night. How did the police find you?
I don't think we got enough time for me to describe that.
No, very quickly, very quickly.
Well, basically, we was arrested outside the park, and we was taken to the precinct. And then in the precinct, we sat there for a long period of time until our parents came. And then once our parents came, you had these detectives who came in and they wanted to question us. And initially, we just was under the impression that they would just question us based on some of the events that happened that night. But they wanted to question us about a rape that happened in the park, which we knew nothing about. And so these interrogations lasted from 14 to 30 hours, with no food, no drink, no water, and it was a lot of pressure. And in the process, we wound up folding under the pressure, and we wound up giving us statements.
And so based on those statements, the court decided that
these were confessions that had been coerced, and the prosecutors decided to charge them with this horrific crime. The woman eventually survived, thank goodness, but it was a celebrated crime. The media covered it. The media was not at all skeptical about what had happened, and they went to jail for this crime, even though they immediately said, once they'd understood what they'd done by implicating themselves, they were told that if they knew that they didn't do it, but if they just said that someone else was doing it, they'd get out and be able to go home. And these were young kids, unfamiliar with the law, good kids from solid families, and it was just a horrible situation.
So the case was known as the Central Park jogger case.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in the film, you're telling the story from the perspective of the 5
We're
kids.
telling the story, period, but what we did that nobody else has done is we thought it was important to go find out what it was like for those who went through it. And so we called the film the Central Park 5. I wouldn't say it's from their perspective, it just permits them to have, after 23 years, a voice, to have a humanity that was taken away from them because the cops fed the newspapers and the prosecutors fed the newspapers lurid descriptions that weren't true and said that these were a wolf pack that had been wilding. They were remorseless and laughed over the plight of this person, and it's just not true.
Yeah, so wilding was a term that was used extensively during that time.
Well, wilding was the term that was given by the police officers.
Okay.
Not that was used by us. That was
Right.
the term that the police officers.
And what does wilding mean?
I have no idea.
Means
the
going
story.
crazy, like acting like a wolf pack, preying on helpless people. That night, 25 or 30, we don't know how many youths went into the park and hassled people. There were a couple of felonies committed, but mostly by bad kids that had been, engaged in other stuff before. But these guys had not had a criminal record, so they had no idea how to behave. All the others just said, "I want to see a lawyer right away." But they were trying to be helpful and cooperative, and they were terrified, and their parents were terrified that something bad might happen to them if they didn't cooperate. And what they didn't know was their rights, that they could have remained silent, that they could have asked for an attorney, and had they known those rights and had they invoked those rights, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today.
Did they go to the Innocence Project?
No, it hadn't been invented.
There wasn't,
then.
there wasn't no Innocence Project back then.
But wasn't one of the founders of Innocence Project somehow involved with it later on?
Much later on, Barry Scheck has had some advice and things to do, but this is much after the exoneration.
So there was no DNA evidence that was examined? Nothing.
Well, no, there was DNA evidence, and it didn't
Not
match
examined.
It didn't match the boys. It matched the actual rapist, who they could have gotten from an assault he did 2 days before, but they didn't bother to follow through with that identification of him, and he would have stopped. He eventually went on to murder a pregnant woman and other assaults, and that's what makes the tragedy more compounded, is that it wasn't just they were blamed for this rape, but the rapist, the real rapist, was permitted to continue to do his horrific things.
And I think in the movie you described that the real rapist actually had been identified by somebody else with a scar on his chin.
Yes, 2 days before he had stitches on his chin, and they even knew his name, and nobody followed through.
And there was a policeman who had been following up on him.
Yeah, and who obviously did not. And one of the detectives, very active in the interrogation of the 5, was also involved later on with the arrest of the actual perpetrator, and they were thinking they were catching him for other crimes, but it would have been just as easy to check his DNA at that moment with the DNA they had from that, and no one did that. So they were so certain that they had the right guys, and there was nothing in their testimony that in any way pointed them to it. Even though they were admitting to it, they just had everything wrong.